Good morning, this is Real World News, QUT student-produced journalism program. My name is Amelia Jackson. Joining me today is PhD candidate and academic at our own QUT, Katrin Langton. Katrin joins me today to share some insights into her PhD work around infant feeding apps and how the technologies impact parents' experience in raising their children. Hi Kat, how are you?
Very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. To start with, would you mind talking us through the different apps and their main features that are being analysed in your research?
Actually, that's a really great point to start on because there's actually two components to my research. So in the first part, I've looked at two specific Australian infant feeding apps called Mum to Mum and Feed Baby, which are quite different in sort of their purpose and features. So Mum to Mum was developed by the Australian Breastfeeding Association and looks mainly at providing breastfeeding information to mothers, whereas Feed Baby looks more at providing the tools for parents to sort of track and record aspects of infant care, for example, feeds, nappies and sleep. So they're really quite different because one of them is geared more towards mums specifically, whereas the other kind of allows both parents to be more involved in recording these activities. And then the second part of my research actually looks at the user experience. So at the moment, I'm actually recruiting parents to talk to about what their use of infant feeding apps and digital media in early parenthood is actually like.
Awesome, thank you. Your research also looks at different gender dynamics and how that affects the parenting experience. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, so like I was mentioning about those two specific apps that I was looking at before, often those infant feeding apps are geared more towards mothers to be used. And this is also what I've been finding in the recruitment for my research is that even though I'm looking for parents more specifically, it's mainly mothers that respond to my call for research participation. And that's often because mothers are more likely to be the primary caregivers, so they're more likely to be the users of these apps. And what I'm particularly interested in is, for example, whether the use of these apps isolates the mother as the caregiver more because she's the one doing the primary caregiving, also doing the recording of the caring activities, instead of maybe talking to her partner about this. So I'm particularly interested also in how it influences sort of the dynamics between parents in who takes on most of the caregiving and how they communicate about their caregiving role. So whether it brings them more together as a parenting team or whether it isolates one person over the other. And that's been quite an interesting thing I've been finding when I've been talking to parents about their use of these apps is that even though often it's the mother recording infant caring activities, they often use these records as a prompt to involve the partner more in what's been going on in their everyday caring activities, and it can also increase the empathy of the partner when they, for example, have access to the app, record some of the caring activities and see sort of what the day has been like for the primary caregiver. Yeah, so it can sort of work both ways.
Awesome, that's really cool. We just covered that a little bit, but can you talk a bit more broadly about specific findings that have arisen from your research that have surprised you?
That have surprised me, yeah. I think what has surprised me is that there's been quite a homogeneous sample that has responded to my calls for research. So it's mainly mothers who are sort of middle class, well educated. This shouldn't really be a surprise because a lot of the research that's been done in this area before, there's been sort of similar things that have come out of that it's a very homogeneous group of people responding to these kinds of calls. But that even though the group is quite homogeneous, the stories that they tell about what early parenthood and the use of infant feeding apps has been like for them, they're really quite diverse, and they often depend on also cultural contexts and the kinds of journeys into parenthood that they've had. So some of the mums, for example, have told me quite emotional stories about their IVF experience into parenthood, and that already makes a difference to how likely they are to be using apps to track. And sort of whether there's been a lot of tracking from health professionals, for example, of their transition into parenthood when, for example, they had to have injections, hormone injections, to ensure that they could even conceive in the first place. And it's been really interesting that a lot of mums have said to me after the interview, oh, this has been like therapy to me, because no one has really been that interested in what it's been like for me, not only in those early months of parenthood, but also the journey into early parenthood itself. So that's been really surprising and really rewarding for me to be able to talk to people about that.
Awesome, thank you. So I understand that the end goal of your research is to help implement this information into future technologies, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe what I should elaborate on a little bit more there as well is that whilst most of the people I've spoken to now have been mums, one of the aims of my research is also to include the perspectives of parents who usually don't get asked about their digital media use in early parenthood, like fathers or parents from same-sex couples, single parents, or gender diverse parents. And so I'm at the moment recruiting more specifically from these groups, and I'm hoping that, because I mentioned before those apps are sort of mainly targeting mothers, that some of these trends that I've been observing on how they can bring other people more into the parenting team, that I'll be able to provide some suggestions on how these apps can actually support more equitable parenting and role sharing between parents. And another thing I'm interested in there is also sort of data privacy considerations. So because the data that's being recorded obviously is about babies, they don't have any say on what happens to that data. So there's also some consideration there of how can we make sure that the data that's being recorded there is secure and doesn't negatively impact on parents or their children down the track.
Cool, thank you. And I guess this ties into our previous question. How would you like to see the current apps improved? Is it just the data privacy or the diversity?
Yeah, so actually the two specific apps that I've been looking at, they're more like case studies for infant feeding apps more broadly. And I think, yes, definitely data privacy considerations are a big topic there. But I think the main thing I would like to come out of this research is that it's not so that the apps are less gendered and actually more inclusive of also other parenting dynamics. So for example, sometimes it can be difficult for single parents to use these apps, specifically if there are sort of repeated prompts to sort of involve your partner in caring activities, or if it's particularly gendered, like how would gay dads, for example, use these kinds of apps. And there are also sort of benchmarking tools sometimes in these apps where they're saying, most babies, for example, have this amount of formula in a day, or they feed this often in a day, and then this can be quite stressful for parents if the children don't meet these benchmarks, when they're not necessarily the same recommendations they would get from health professionals, but the app is just taking an average of all the babies whose parents are logging infant activities here. So yeah, I think to make sure that these apps are more equitable, that the data security and privacy is less opaque, so they're more open about what happens to the data and whether it's being shared with third parties, which is quite a large concern in terms of children's rights and their data privacy. So I think they're the two areas that I'm hoping to contribute to the most.
Do you have anything more to add?
Unless you have anything else in particular that you're really interested in, I think that's probably a good sort of, in a nutshell, overview of my research. And thank you so much for having me today to be able to share this information.
Of course, I was just about to thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. That is all we have time for today. My name is Amelia Jackson. This is Real World News, and we'll see you next time.